All right, it's 5, so I'll officially kick it off.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm Fernando. It's great to see everybody. Thanks for having me. It's exciting to be here. Today I'm going to try and take you through how to make a development portfolio using serverless technologies like AWS's Lambda, the serverless framework, and putting everything together theoretically in 7 days. It is a little bit of a title catcher just to catch your eye. There's a lot of stuff that you would need to know already to try and do that in 7 days. But this is kind of in the spirit of, I think it's like Codevember, basically trying to build like something throughout the month of November. So I'm going to try and take you through that and get you all the resources that you would need to do that whole process, regardless of the actual amount of time it ends up taking you and what you end up going through. So let's get started. So someday you're either going to be looking for a job or a new job, and you're going to want to actually maybe get a promotion or something along those lines. And for those of you who are in that situation, you're going to want to actually be able to showcase your skills. And the reason for that is if you're going into your first job in tech, there's going to be a huge barrier to getting that first job. When you have a recruiter who sees you that has, maybe you have a year of experience, you have your first job in tech, you have software engineer on your resume, you have something else on your resume that shows you've been in tech, they kind of assume already that you have a set of skills and you've already learned a set of information that makes you a candidate for lots of other positions. But if you don't have that, then there's a much bigger barrier to try and get in. And this is part of what this presentation is designed, both to show you some stuff about serverless, but also to give you some practical tips when you're going into that process of trying to look for your first job or advancing further in your career. So here's a few suggestions that we're going to go through. A few disclaimers before I get started. Much of this presentation applies to anyone who is learning development skills still. So there's some stuff in here that maybe you already know, there's some stuff maybe you already don't. It's definitely assumed that you're gonna have to spend some time learning different things that you don't know already. And I also assume a little bit of development experience so that when you're actually coding and when we're talking later on, if there's something that if there's something I assume that you don't know, feel free to pop in and let me know that, and we can try and take a step back and just work through it a little. And I also try and link to as many resources as I can to get you started wherever you are. So, quick recap of what we're actually going to do. We're going to go through a few of the days of what I imagine your kind of theoretical week would be when you're doing this sort of work. And then towards the end, we're actually going to start around day 1. We're basically going to try and go through a first few set of steps to get you through the basics that you'll need. So we'll need to know what we need to know before we start. We'll set up a development environment with the serverless framework in AWS. We'll find some starter templates, example projects, and other cool things that you can actually pick up and put into your development portfolios, and some other free tutorials and resources. And then try and come up with our own ideas for a project, which can be actually one of the most challenging steps, is coming up with something that you're interested in, that's the right size, that's going to be the right fit for you to actually work on, and all of those stuff too. And 4, 5, and 6, you actually have to build a project and show off your project at the end so that you get some of the credit from actually having done all that work. So let's go ahead and jump in. A few things to know. A lot of the stuff that I do is written in Python. So any examples you see later, if you haven't had any familiarity with the Python programming language, there's a bunch of resources here that are either taken from my Redmond Python meetup in Redmond or other online resources that will just help you get started. And I'll send this presentation out and give it to Clark later on so you can all access all the links and everything that's in here. So those will all give you some resources there. I'll also use some basic HTML and JavaScript. I try and keep it pretty simple without throwing in too many frameworks in my demo so that nobody has to learn React or Vue or Angular or something else, just to kind of understand the basics of what's happening in the demos that I write. And just keep in mind that for actually learning all of this, it's definitely going to take more than a week, and if you're like me, it'll keep going on for your whole career. You're still learning Python, you're still learning everything else about web development. There's lots of stuff you'll continue learning. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started with the basic steps that we'll need to know. Now, I'll go through this in a lot more detail towards the end once I kind of breeze through the first part of the presentation. But the first things that we'll be doing, we'll be creating an AWS account, and we're going to try and stay within the AWS free tier, which if you don't have any familiar with what AWS is, it's Amazon Web Services. It basically allows you to create an account that relies on AWS's Amazon Web Services infrastructure. And so you run code on their servers, you can use their servers, but a lot of what's included is actually pretty cool for us when we're talking specifically about serverless development, because it lets us actually go in there and use these services that give us pretty significant leeway to build our own applications, to actually scale them pretty effectively, and also not have to pay very much as students, because I started doing this kind of stuff when I was a student. I didn't want to pay a bunch of money for servers, and I just wanted to be able to kind of try my demo projects out without having to worry about all of that. So that is one cool thing about this with the AWS account and the free tier. We're going to end up creating an AWS account, setting up some credentials, getting a few dependencies set up. So we'll use Node.js on our machines. We'll install it. We'll install the serverless framework. Those are all kind of prerequisites to getting the serverless framework running. And we'll also set up the AWS CLI so we can actually interact with AWS itself. So those are some of the kind of base tools that we'll work on a little bit later in the presentation. So what would we do on day 2? Let's assume we already went through the stuff we'll be doing in a little bit. After we actually get all those dependencies installed, how do we start? Well, what we're going to end up doing is taking a bunch of templates and tutorials and start looking for things that we actually want to maybe start building ourselves. And there's a lot of different examples that we can use. Specifically, the framework that I'll be mentioning later on, the serverless framework, has a bunch of these boilerplates, which don't look super cool here, but basically all of these are already built out bits of code that you can go in and just see how things work, and pretty quickly just run a few commands to deploy yourself in your own AWS account and actually get something for your work. And that's a lot easier to do than trying to code it all from scratch, because you can just deploy it with their code and then start modifying the cool things that you want to do. And applying that to the sorts of projects that you're interested in and changing around. So in addition to these, there's also 1.5 million demos online that other people have written, that people who get bored and play around like myself have written, just to try and give you all a few examples of things that you can build yourself and using your technologies and things like that. So this was just like a very quick Google search to try and find a few of those, and I definitely recommend doing that if there's a specific niche of something that you want to take a look at. Then also, for resources on day 2, I'll give you access to a few free resources that you can go in and learn more about the technologies on your own time. These will be like online services that you can just log in, make an account. There'll be free trial periods, and then you can basically just get all of that additional knowledge that I might be able to give you during this short talk, and continue learning and building things yourself. So,
thank you so much.
Oh, of course, happy to.
That's why I have a picture for you.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
So day 3, after you've kind of played around and started like just trying things out, you might be getting a little bit bored by the demos. So you're gonna have to come up with a few ideas for yourself. And normally when I start doing that, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm not really sure the kinds of projects that I want to build. I don't really know where to get started. So I like to try and think about it in just a few kind of constraints, because sometimes when you put constraints on your idea process, it actually makes it easier to think of things within that. So I always try and pick something interesting to myself personally, that I've been curious about building, or I had like a silly idea. Then I also try and come up with something small, because if you come up with something super big that you want to build, it can be super great in the long run, but also you're going to get demotivated by getting a 10th of the way through the project and then realizing that you're too busy, or getting halfway through and realizing that you don't like it, or anything else like that, and basically just stumbling and falling and then getting super demotivated because you didn't finish it. So I always suggest that you start with the smallest thing you think you can finish, and then you can always add to it later if you're still having fun. I'd also suggest using tools that are somewhat familiar if you can, just because at least some part of it should be easy enough that you don't get discouraged. If you're, for example, building a new application, or you're using a front-end framework you've never used on top of a cloud service that you've never touched before and you know nothing about, with the language that you just on a whim decided to choose. If you have the motivation, the energy, and the time to like breeze through all of that, then I'd go for it, but I definitely don't. So I always try and stick to at least a few things that I know, and then throw maybe 1 or 2 new things in to keep myself interested. And there's also a bunch of links here that I'll give you in the presentation to give you more suggestions from others to kind of keep you motivated there. Another really important thing that I think when I'm picking projects is I like to find a data set that I'm interested in, because usually some form of my projects center around some kind of data. You don't always have to do this. You can always just make something fun that doesn't have any data behind it, but I think it gives a little bit more flair to whatever you're working on. So a few suggestions if you just wanted to play around with open data sets. There's data.gov, which has a vast array of information from the United States government about a bunch of different categories that you'll see here. And then you might also have like niche sites that you just had noticed and been curious about the data sets. So one of those for me is the living wage calculator that MIT has, which essentially provides a bunch of information on living wages for people in different parts of the world or different parts of the United States, and how those change depending on the size of families and things like that. So if you have other kind of quirky or nerdy interests that you have related to data, it can always be kind of fun to try and visualize those, try and create an application from that, and that's another thing. Okay, there's a lot of other resources in terms of data and things that we could get into. But after we've kind of selected all that, we really just want to build the project. And as I mentioned before, you want to start small and sketch something out, maybe pick one thing to learn. So when I'm talking about small, I really mean small, and I really mean planning a prototype and fighting your inner perfectionist. I'll be the first to admit that this looks really bad. That's because I'm not a front-end developer. I really have not a ton of experience in front-end development. I don't use that many front-end frameworks. I can just, cobble some CSS and HTML together, use some other demos if I want to change something up or make it look nicer that some front-end developer has already kindly and graciously put their code up and MIT licensed it so I can have fun with it. But when I'm doing things by hand, it ends up looking something like this. So this is a project that I'll actually touch on a little bit later, but try to make it so that you don't put these really high expectations and barriers on yourself when you're working on those projects, because that's going to end up being really discouraging and hard to finish. So keep it simple, basically. Okay, so after that, you basically want to build your project. And when you're done building your project, which we're kind of skimming over because we're going to touch on installing resources later, you want to show it off. And the reason you want to show it off is because you get better, chances to get contacted by recruiters, or you get really cool colleges that come and invite you to do presentations, or somebody reaches out to you on LinkedIn and asks you to come to give a talk. So basically, you want to be able to get something out of what you're doing. It's great just to get the experience, that's really awesome. But why not go the next step and actually try and showcase it in a way that could get you some benefits as well. And a few things that I suggest for that are starting a blog. You can do it for free. You can get a Medium account. You can write on there. I don't have too much experience with that. I just decided to get my own blog and put it together with a static site. You can use CMSs. You can pay WordPress a few bucks a year or a month or however much they cost. The main thing I'd suggest with starting a blog that's a technical blog is just making sure that they have an ability to have code styling and maybe snippets of GitHub code or something like that, because in the long run, you're going to want to showcase your technical skill and your technical knowledge. And if you can't format code in a good way, it's not going to look good for you. So just make sure that they have that before you get into it. I think Medium does, and there's plenty of other tools that you can always peek around at. If you want a custom domain, you can usually get those for $15 a year from some company or other. AWS will also sell it to you. After the blog, or in addition to the blog, definitely set up a GitHub. And the reason for the GitHub is because that's another place that recruiters might look for you. You might have to submit your GitHub to somebody else in the long run, and they'll want to see what you've done. If you have a bunch of cool projects that you've been working on, well, then that's just a plus for them and also a plus for you, because when you're working on a new project, you can always go back there, like I did for this presentation, look at something old I did, kind of change it around a little bit, and put it together for the next thing that you're working on. So that's another thing. I'd also suggest writing a README. READMEs are basically just small files written in something called Markdown, and you write the instructions on how to install your code. You write the instructions on what it is. And it's good to actually have those, because then people know more about your project and are more motivated to kind of check it out, and potentially, if you're doing an open source project, actually help you and contribute to it. And it also just shows that you have the ability to communicate what you're actually developing, because that's an important skill. If I just write some code and I leave it in GitHub, nobody knows what the heck it does, then it's not quite as useful or impressive as if I document it well and can communicate what the actual function is. So that's kind of that process of publishing your code in GitHub. There's other tools as well. GitHub is probably one of the most normally used for this sort of stuff, so that's just what I'd recommend. Okay, so that was the real quick overview of the steps that you would theoretically take. I'll, again, share all the links and everything above that, but for the next kind of few minutes, we're going to jump into hands-on stuff, because I'd like to get you all started actually having some of these tools and the ability to ask questions while I'm still here. And then obviously, towards the end, I'll just give out all those links and other things so you can keep going. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through and actually start the process of deploying a project and trying it as far as we can. A few assumptions that I have right now is that you have a laptop and that you hopefully have Git installed. If you don't, we can definitely chat about that a little bit more and try and get it installed on your computers. And that you maybe have a basic familiarity with a command line or a terminal. If one of those is not the case, that's definitely fine. I'll just come over and chat with you a little bit more as we're working through. And next up, the first main step here, you may already have this. This might already be something you don't have to do, but we're actually going to go and create an AWS account and an admin user to try and get some prerequisites going. So the first thing that means is you'll just have to actually go to this URL and create an account. And this is the point when somebody can call me an AWS shell or something, and that's fine. So if you can't read that, it's aws.amazon.com/free. Sorry, it's a little bit small. You can also probably Google it and find it. And at this point, it's going to be more workshop style, so we're transitioning out of me just talking and more, if you have questions, raise your hand so I can go over there and help you get started. I'm going to write some of these URLs down on the board and then go through the rest of my slides as we keep going. And let's find a number here. There's that URL. Now, I'm just going to start going through pretty slowly, but feel free to stop me if I go too far. So that whole confirmation process, you might get stuck on that. It might ask you for I don't know, different bits of information. I don't know if AWS has changed that recently or not, but eventually after you create your account, because you need to do some best practices in terms of securing your account to make sure that your API credentials don't leak and you don't actually accidentally give somebody kind of peeking around on somewhere to try and find your API credentials access to everything. We'll do kind of a few security steps to take that under control. And one of those is to create an admin account specifically for your serverless user. And we'll chat about that in just a minute. So let's do, let me see how to navigate this a little bit. If you finish the step that I'm showing on the board, just I don't know, look up at me. Who has an AWS account already? Just raise your hand super high.
I didn't use it for a long time.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so what we might end up doing is I might let those folks who don't just kind of keep going through and creating it, and then I'll go back a little bit and we'll catch back up there. So it sounds like maybe 2 or 3 people who don't yet, and that is totally fine. I kind of expected a little bit of time to go through. Cool. So we'll pause here, and I'll answer a few of the questions that came back up, and that's how I wanted these, so we could chat while everybody was getting caught up. So I think you had a few questions relating to architectures. Yeah. So were you mainly just asking for model architectures, of how to build applications? Because I think you said MVC. Yeah. Yeah, so I think it really probably depends on what you're building. So I think a really common serverless architecture
lots of questions, but we can't hear you.
That I've seen before has been microservice oriented. Like you have a front end application that you build in some front end framework, or maybe custom JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and then you host all that in, for example, S3 on AWS. And that's just a static site of files, and it calls API endpoints that are generated by the serverless framework, for example.
Yeah, I know that part. My question actually is because right now what I'm currently using for the backend is just a use RESTful API, and the view call the backend.
Yeah.
And I have a controller to take that call and decide which model, user, log in. I call the user model to handle this thing. But for serverless, seems like just have one function there, and don't have this user model. So we just put everything in that handler.
That's a good question. I think a lot of that ends up becoming preference potentially,
okay.
And depending on how you're building it and what you're building, that becomes more of a development question than maybe architectural. I'm not sure if I'm necessarily the best person to just kind of dictate anything on that. Normally what I'd say is for that kind of stuff, it sounds like you already kind of know a little bit about how that gets split up. So you'd have some sort of static front end, some sort of front end hosted in something like S3, or maybe you're hosting it on a server instead, but that is going to call what you said. It's going to call the backend services that you have. Maybe that one function that's handling user logins, maybe it's you can host like things like Flask inside of serverless environments. So I've built applications that are like Flask applications that run inside of Lambda, but that don't actually handle views. They just handle like the API backend, and then views are all left up to the front end code.
If I put everything like business logic and controllers job in one function, is that easy to be tested?
Yeah. So that's a good question. So,
I'm so suffer with testing like that, but after I use MVC, it's really easy to be tested because I can mock the the modules function.
That is definitely one of the challenges that have. There's started to be more and more tooling around that, but that remains to be one of the challenges because of all the things that you're relying on like AWS for, and the fact that you are giving up a bunch of control to them and kind of just assuming it'll work. So there are tools to like mock tests. I'm trying to remember what the DynamoDB one is. There's like a library to fit like a fake DynamoDB, DynamoDB local or something.
Local.
So you can use that to like write some tests, like test a few things out. But overall, you're gonna want to maybe just start looking at bigger applications and seeing what they're doing and going from there. I know that's not a very satisfactory answer because it's a fun question though. Oops.
I found 2014, I did not pay for 40 cents. They blocked my account.
Oh no.
Yeah. For me, my experience with AWS, there was one time I was doing a Rails project and I accidentally pushed my secret key and everything, and I immediately got an email from GitHub and also with AWS. That's a lengthy email, and aside from that, they created like a case in my account.
Yeah.
I need to like change the access key. I think change the password too, and there's 3 stuff. And then once I've done that, they rechecked it. They said, okay, they're fine now. But if I didn't do that, they were like, we're gonna cancel your account.
Yeah, exactly, because I want you to do it. Okay, cool. I'm gonna jump ahead a little. For the people who already have accounts, we'll just keep going. For the people who don't, I'm happy to just chat a little bit more after.
I don't know,
Basically, once you get into your AWS account and actually create it and get into IAM, which is Identity and Access Management, you're going to want to create a user that you can use in combination with the serverless framework. And the reason for that is because you'll start with a root user that has access to everything, to do everything, to create thousands of dollars worth of charges on your account. And it just has basically root access to your account. And to try and limit that a little so you at least are using a user that isn't that all-powerful user, but still has a lot of permissions, you'll create a serverless admin user. And you can name it whatever you'd like. That's just what I ended up naming it. You'll go in here to the users into IAM, and you'll get in here. And the main things that you'll need to focus on are actually making sure that the user will have API keys. And the API keys will be used in combination with the AWS command line interface and also with the serverless framework tooling as well. So you'll need to, when you do that, go in here and actually make sure that it has programmatic access. It can have console access too, just because it is better from a security perspective not to use your root user on a daily basis. You really just want to like kind of put those keys in a password manager and not really use them unless you really need them. And then just use like an admin user on a daily basis. So just make sure that when you're creating that, it can be some other name, but that you do have programmatic access, and then you move on to the next step and you actually configure some permissions for it. Some of these screenshots might have changed a little bit depending on the UI changes that AWS made, but when you're actually dealing with those permissions, what I usually suggest is that when you're managing users in AWS, the best practice is to put them in groups So you'd have an admin group that has the set of permissions. That does complicate it a little bit because you don't just attach permissions directly to the user, but it is a best practice to do that in case you, for example, grow your small project with a bunch of other people, you want to add more admins, you want to add developers, do other stuff like that. Well, then you also want to be able to control the permissions in a more efficient way. So you create a group for that user that you just created, and it gets administrator permissions, and then you actually create the user, and after that whole step is done, you'll actually have the new user inside the account, and this will be one of the only opportunities that you actually get to use these two values here. I think the access key might hang around, you can reference that later, but the secret access key, you get one chance to copy it down, or else you'll have to go back and make a new access key. And basically the reason for this is so that nobody can go back in there and grab the credentials and pretend to be this user later. And the same thing for the password information. I think that'll only show up once. So make sure to copy these down and store them securely. My one really big security note here is that these keys, along with the information for your root user, can be used to charge you a lot of money if you put them up somewhere publicly. There's lots of horror stories with people like throwing their API keys into a GitHub repository and accidentally pushing that publicly. And it is funny to think about and like laugh at a little, but also you don't want AWS emailing you going, hey, you owe us $3,000 or something. So I think sometimes if that does happen, they will try and notify you. GitHub will try and notify you, and they might forgive you. But just in general, probably err on the safe side, and don't put those anywhere insecure. Get a password manager. This is my previous proselytizing my password manager before. Okay, so that's first kind of step. Are there any questions about that whole process really quick before we jump on?
Anyone?
I'm not on the same page. That's the why.
Yes.
He's doing a group name.
Yeah. So you can just call it admin.
Create a user.
Admin group, whatever you want. Really, it's just to. It seems like an unnecessary step, right? Because it's just your account. I just try and only say the best practice stuff when I'm giving talks, so nobody gets mad at me later if I'm telling them to do the wrong thing. Yeah, administrator access is the policy you want. That does still give you super broad permissions. The serverless framework uses fairly broad permissions because it's going to be used to manage creation of all the resources that you're creating inside your AWS account. It's going to manage permissions for deploying things to your AWS account, so it needs some relatively broad permissions to use lots of different services. So that's why we're giving it admin access. Generally, you use the principle of least privilege and kind of taper down the permissions, but because it does kind of need a decent amount of access, we don't do that. Are there other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, without giving payment information that needs to be done.
You might need to. The thing about the serverless framework, or the thing about kind of the demos that we're working on, is it shouldn't charge you. So it should be free if you stay within the limits of the free tier. I don't know if you can create it without a credit card. Maybe you can. I'm not sure about that. Yeah.
I don't have to use even with Google Cloud, they don't allow you without the credit card.
Yeah, I'm sorry if that's a limit there. But once you have that, if you manage to just get a credit card, it shouldn't charge you as long as you don't buy a domain from them or don't spin up a bunch of servers. If you just kind of use a few technologies and read up on what the free tier offers and what's in it, you should be able to build some relatively cool projects without paying.
Okay.
So just, think about that a little and hopefully you can get it going. Sorry about that.
If you look at my dashboard, I lost the direction.
Yeah,
Because
sure.
I'm using free one, and I use the dashboard.
So
If you have a laptop,
so you
you
want
can
to
follow.
my identity.
Here.
Identity
Oh,
access.
Okay.
Uh-oh.
Okay, that's what I have to
I
wait.
can't help you there, unfortunately.
Because I just don't pay the money, then there's, and you have to wait 24 hours.
Oh, okay. I can't help you too much there. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I will send you the presentation with all the screenshots out and a link to a few other tutorials so you can keep going through them.
Okay, so I'll go to another student's page.
Sorry about that. Okay, so next up, we're going to just jump through a few steps to actually get Node and serverless framework installed. So the serverless framework is an NPM package, a node package manager package, and it's used to actually speed up the process and make the process a little easier for our development when we're working with AWS, when we're working with actually a lot of other cloud services. So with the serverless framework, you can deal with AWS, you can deal with Google Cloud, you can deal with Azure, you can deal with like another 5 or 6 handful of other sorts of services and things that you can spin up serverless projects with. So that'll end up being pretty useful for us. But the prerequisite is actually using Node.js. I suggest using 6.10.3 because that's the AWS, that's the version of the AWS runtime that that's the version of Node that the Lambda service uses in AWS, which means that your code will actually be running with 6.10.3. So you probably can get away with using a different version, but it's just important to be aware of that because there are changes between.
I think nowadays they also support 8.
They may indeed have updated that. I was just writing code in 6.10, and I know that's one of the runtimes. Yeah. So I just say pick one of the available runtimes and try and stick to that. Now that whole process of installing Node, I don't go through too much. I have a few links on actually getting that set up. But basically, you can just Google that if you don't already have Node installed. It should have instructions for installing it on like Windows or Mac or anything else, and it's a pretty quick install. Does anybody need? Nobody needs Wi-Fi in here, right? Everybody. I should have asked that at the very beginning. Okay, cool. So after you actually get Node installed, this will just help you like test to make sure you have the right version. Sorry, this is a little hard to see.
Whose machine is widespread? Yours?
Yeah.
Stay with the screen. Or if you don't, stay come here. Yeah. Look at this screen.
Thank you. Yeah, good call.
Yes. How about you?
Yeah.
This machine. Okay, stay with this machine. How about you? You better keep on now. Stay with the other machine. Then we can speed up.
Yeah, of course. So
Stay with it.
say that again. Yeah.
So what's the command that I?
So this I skipped ahead a little bit. So I didn't want to go through all the installation steps on everybody's machine. So first step is installing Node.js. So my suggestion there is if you already have it installed, cool. Does anybody not have it installed? Okay, so for you, run this Google search, and I guarantee you that this site will tell you how to install it on your computer.
Yeah.
It's probably just going to be a quick download, and then you'll just click install and go through the install process.
Don't worry about that. At least one or two machines can move forward.
Sure.
Then later we repeat this one with our team. Yes.
Got it.
Just to
Okay.
move forward. Yes.
So right after that, after you have Node installed, the actual stuff to do to check is whatever command line, terminal prompts, whatever you're using, just jump in there and check what version you have. If you're using a really old version, then try and update that and fix that. This should just output something like 6.10.3 to show you what you're using. You can always just hit Node and actually go in and test that it's working. But really, the main thing is after you've done all this, maybe you also want to check you have NPM. You should have that to allow you to actually get packages. And you can do that with npm-v to show you the version. Assuming all this kind of works, then the actual way to install the serverless framework, because it's an NPM package, is actually npm install serverless-g to install it globally. And that's just going to install the framework on your machine, basically at the highest level so that you can use it in any project and not have to worry about whether it's installed in Node modules folder if you're using Node.
You installed, right? Yeah.
So does anybody else, and I will also send this out, so don't worry too much about the notes. You'll have it. Question, yes.
That's version 10.0
Of Node? Let's try.
That point to 13.0.
There's I'll send out a few links that will also explain how to install it on every machine, how to use Node version manager or npm to check what version you have and how to switch over if you need to.
So if we have the most advanced one, it does not work.
It probably will. I always say to use the version that AWS runs, but it probably will. Yeah, I can't guarantee it because that's the one I tested with when I ran all the code, but yeah. Okay, so assuming that you have all that, then you just run that one command at the bottom and actually it should install the framework. And if you want to check whether or not the framework works or is installed, your version will probably be different. You can do serverless-v and it'll tell you what the version of the framework is. If it's that or above, you'll probably be fine as long as it's 1 point something. And one thing about when you're working with the serverless framework is you can actually run either serverless or SLS is the shorthand for serverless. and you can use them interchangeably for whatever commands you're running. So if you want the shorthand, SLS-V. Now, one thing that I want to mention here really quickly is that the next thing we're installing is the AWS CLI, and for some computers that have pip installed already, which is a Python package manager, you can just install it with pip. But for other machines, you might need to go through the actual installation steps to figure out how AWS prefers you install the AWS CLI on your machine. I have all those links in the presentation, so you'll look at those as well. You can try this. It looks like maybe some of you have Windows machines, so that might not work. In which case, we can actually go to the docs and I can get you set up there towards the end. But I'm going to kind of breeze through that a little bit so that we can get to the end and just kind of do workshop stuff. Once you've installed that, you're going to set up the AWS CLI to actually work with AWS. So this is a prerequisite because the serverless framework kind of relies on that in the background to actually make calls to the API. So what you'll do there is you'll actually set an access key and a secret access key ID and a secret access key, which are those values that you got in that earlier step when you created the IAM user. And you also set a default region. Usually I just default to US East 1.
So
Yes,
AWS is a command?
yes. So that is a command after you install the command line interpreter. And that, I have a link for. But you want to go back to that? We can totally can.
No, they have to go to class at 6 o'clock. Just to
Okay.
speed up.
I'll
Don't
read
worry.
through it and I'll send you everything.
Just
Okay.
to move forward.
We'll just keep
Yeah,
going.
yeah.
So basically, this will allow you, once you have that command line tool installed, you'll be able to just get this set up with that command and then go through and actually start your first project. So this is kind of towards the end of the presentation. So this is an example of one of the projects that I had with that silly, like really horrible UI. Basically what this is I took a bunch of photos and I took those photos and turned them into color schemes. So I processed them with Python and loaded them all up, go right back here, and loaded them all up into a DynamoDB table where I just had it so that I would get a random value from that table back every time I hit an API endpoint. And then it changed the scheme, color scheme of the page every time. So I had a little bit of JavaScript that just parsed that data from some RGB values, and then depending on the photo, it got some different colors. A lot of them are really ugly. Turns out it wasn't the best UI decision, but it was kind of a fun project. So that's basically towards the end of the presentation, just to give you all those tools to get started. The hardest part will actually be just trying to play around with it yourself and finding something that you want to build. But in the last few minutes, I can just give you some of those resources to get you started. How does that sound?
Yeah, that's good.
Cool.
Good. Yeah.
Let's do questions now as I write a few of the resources on the board. And Clark, I'll send it to you if you get a chance to email everybody.
Yes. So would you access your GitHub now? Then
Yes, so you can, yeah, I can just go ahead and go there. So this is the actual code for the project.
so you can have a demo now also.
Yeah.
This is yours, right?
Yes, so these are all my projects.
Okay. Which project you want to show? Okay.
So this is Chameleon, which is the name of the project after I decided to give it a more fun name than color scheme. So basically the way it works is it has all these, you can't really see it well with the lights, but it has all these color schemes in a database, and every time you refresh the page, the actual JavaScript code goes and takes values that it gets from an API, and it reassigns the colors of all of these different divs to those values. So we want to dive in and take a look at that. Let's go ahead and peek real quickly at some of the code. Basically in there's an index page and a main.css page. I was serious when I said I don't do anything complicated with code. In here, it's just a simple HTML page with a bunch of different divs that get something like different IDs that say dominant, color 1, color 2, color 3, color 4, whatever. Super bad code that's super verbose, but it's okay because we're just playing around. And then some pretty quick JavaScript that's also super verbose. And it goes in here and it just makes a simple HTTP request and it sends it to an endpoint URL. I didn't put that in here, but basically the actual site has a specific URL that AWS provides you after you deploy your API. And it makes a quick GET call to that and returns some information that then gets parsed in here and sets the color value of that data that gets returned. And that just changes the palette inside those divs. So that's why every time you go to that page and you refresh it, it's just going to go and get another one of those nasty color schemes, and it's going to change the page.
So from the code, where can I see the serverless feature? Explain again.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and go back to the code. So that's just some of the simple UI, but let's go and actually take a look at what we're deploying. So when we actually build this with the serverless framework, the easiest way to get started with it is you just go and copy a project, and it'll probably have a file that looks like this. It's called serverless.yml.
YAML, this is YAML?
Yes, it is YAML. Yeah. Yeah, and in here, you'll basically get the setup for your whole project. So all the infrastructure that's required to deploy this project, except for those two files that I showed you, the CSS and the HTML, is inside here. Basically, it goes through and says, okay, what is the name of the provider you're using? In this case, we're using AWS, not Google, not Azure. What's the actual runtime that you want to run your functions in, the code that you're running in? And so in this case, this was a while ago, so I was writing this in Python 2.7. And then you set up some other configuration, and you create different resources that your project is relying on. So in this particular case, it needs an IAM role to actually run in there, and that's basically permissions to actually execute different things inside of an AWS environment. So this just tells it what it's allowed to do, and it has some variables that kind of go in, and depending on some of the variables there, we'll set it all up. The next thing you need to do that's not just permissions is actually creating the code that's going to run whenever you're doing things. So I created a CRUD app that really only uses the get function once it's deployed, but basically it would let me create different colors in a DynamoDB table. It would let me delete different information from a DynamoDB table where all this is stored, and also get a specific color if I had that, or get a random color as well. And all these particular things are referencing small Python functions that just live right here, and we'll take a look at that in just a sec. But those functions, in addition to those, you have resources, which are different bits of infrastructure that AWS provides. So it could be like maybe you have a queue of messages. You might define that here. Maybe you have another resource that you want to actually use. In this case, there's only one. It's a DynamoDB table, which just stores the information that I've already preloaded into it, and then just sticks around and allows me to query it later. The last thing at the very end is I included some code here that would allow you to actually deploy it into AWS and actually show it on an actual URL instead of just running it locally, which you could also do. So let's go ahead and take a really quick look at some of that code too. So here, so like I was mentioning, all of these different functions are pretty small. I could have done this all in one function probably and just use different methods inside of it depending on how I wanted to do it, but I thought it was easier just to break it out to showcase how they all worked. So in about 30 lines, we import a library called Boto3 at the very top. That's a SDK that AWS provides so we can develop in Python. And then just a few other built-in libraries of Python. If you've never used it before, it has a bunch of those, which is why I like it. The last thing is really just a kind of Python quirk that has to do with how decimals are stored and encoded in JSON, and how we fix that is through this bit of code, but you can basically ignore that. And then we set up DynamoDB basically to interact with that tool. And then we have the main kind of meat and potatoes, which is the get function that we're defining that takes an event in context, which is the way that functions are structured inside of AWS. And I'm giving a lot of jargon here that you may not understand, but that's okay because it's a 1-hour talk. I'll give you the resources to understand all of this. And then basically we go in and we get the table that we're working with. And inside of that, we just get a particular item from the table and return that information back to everything else. Now, what this ends up looking like and doing is the serverless framework actually creates an API endpoint for this. So we actually get a real URL that if I go, for example, back here and we view the page source in here, that's way brighter, sorry about that. It's just going to give us something like this that goes into our actual HTML code, and we just make a GET request to that, and it gives us a random color back, and then that just gets parsed by that code right there. Does that give a more comprehensive understanding of how that works, and what questions?
How about authentication done here? That's
none. There's none in this.
You're not.
So you can make calls to this API if you want. It's set up so that if somebody decides to DDoS me, it won't cost me that much, just because I didn't give it enough capacity to cost me anything. But yeah, if you wanted to right now, you could literally just type this URL into your browser, and it would give you back the actual information that it gives back to the API. So basically, it's just some escape JSON that it goes and loads up, and then changes these RGB values on the page. Yeah, good question. Other questions that I can help answer?
Other projects I like.
Other projects, okay. So if you want to see a
No,
bunch
did
of,
you finish explaining all code, then go to the other project?
yeah, I think.
How about the other one, all the other one source code here?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, that's most of the source
Yeah.
code. There's a little bit of information here that's like how I got the data, but that's not really serverless related. That just has to do like, I have a bunch of images that I downloaded from a site. There's a little Python script that I wrote to go to this website called Pexels and download a bunch of pretty stock photography and just put them on my local machine. And there's another file that I wrote that's going to actually take the RGB values in those images, and I rely on this library called Color Thief that processes them, and it outputs data that looks like this, and then I load that into DynamoDB. But that part is handled by all this, but it doesn't really have anything to do with the serverless infrastructure. It's just kind of setup work to get this API to run. Good question.
Any more questions?
Okay, now another project, okay.
Another project? All right, let's go. So you can take a look at any of these projects if you want. All the code, and these are just mine, but there's plenty of other ones. I have a blog you can also take a look at if you want more projects that I've written or more tutorials that I've written. This will also give you some information on like different AWS things. It's not all serverless stuff, so I'll just leave it here. This is all serverless tutorials. So if you go to serverlessfoo.com, basically I have either a blog post or some code or some explanation of all these different things that I've built and just tried to play around with to demonstrate how these things work. So hopefully this will give you a good place to get started. Most of them are kind of silly projects that just involve like, you know, that just involve like, how do I check when there's tickets available for an event that I want to go to? I want to deploy a function that's going to go scrape the page and see if the thing has changed to say tickets available. How do I like make a silly little app that has reCAPTCHA to make sure somebody's not a robot? Oh, dang, I was really hoping I wouldn't do that. Mountains or hills? Mountains or hills, right? I'm really bad at these. Okay, thank God. So basically just go in here and I took some text of a book that I read by Benjamin Franklin. He has a bunch of descriptions of people. I kind of tried to go through the whole book with some code and take all those out, put those in a database and randomly get one of those. And he has some kind of sick burns about people that he talks about. So this is a quote from Benjamin Franklin. He was not very expert. So the idea is you can go in here and get a quote that's about you. But so apparently I'm not very expert. So, yeah, so it's just silly stuff like that that you can build actually really quickly and easily with not that much code without having to manage too much infrastructure. And this only costs like, I don't know, probably like less than $0.01 a year to run, as long as I don't put it on a custom domain. So the custom domain hosts all my projects, and it probably costs like 13, 14 bucks a year to have up there. And it's pretty cheap in case like 2 million people decide to view my site for some reason. It shouldn't cost me too much more. Yeah.
So question, two questions.
Yeah, go.
How come you were exposed to serverless development? What was your motivation?
Yeah.
Because of what you have. And second one is, why Amazon? I know that part, why Amazon? You can go to the other one.
Good question.
Yes,
So I was working as a support engineer 2-ish, 3-ish years ago at a company in Philadelphia. That was my first tech job. And they had AWS infrastructure there. So I just had the chance to learn it there. So that was why AWS, just because it was the first thing it was the first thing I learned for work and had to learn for work. And I was too lazy to learn anything else. Right now, it's kind of also probably the most full service offering out of all the cloud platforms. So that's maybe the only other reason, but I'm also biased because I use it the most. And in terms of why serverless specifically, in my opinion, and it's definitely biased, the newer something is, the easier it is to become an expert at it.
I agree with that.
So like,
because nobody did it.
Yeah, so when something's new, there's nobody else who knows it better than you. So if you're the first person on the wave of like the new front end development framework or the new technology, then like you're the expert because nobody else has used it yet. So,
how much this is new now, market?
How much what?
Yeah, I think this is pretty new, but how much new? My student here, some winter time and next winter quarter, we want to work on this project. our whole project is we want to compare 4 different types of serverless. Amazon first.
Yeah.
Then Azure function,
Yeah,
Google
yeah.
function, and that. Okay.
Yeah.
How much this is new? How much it will help my student job market?
Huh. So how much? So I guess the question, like, how much is new from those technologies? Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, they're always adding new features. Lambda's been around. So AWS Lambda has been around for 5-6 years now, maybe. I'm trying to remember what year it actually came out. But so it's getting a little older now, I guess. But I think it's still probably one of the most starting to gain kind of more traction because people are looking at some of the benefits of it. But if your kind of career goal is like software engineering, sure, yeah, I mean, it's good to have that experience, but you'll also just need to focus on, like solid development skills, and you probably will still need to have some understanding of like architecture and operating system and all of that kind of stuff too. Again, I was kind of biased because I was like, oh, well, if I learn this, I'll have the most experience in this, and it'll be easier to, kind of develop some stuff there. So
Yeah, like to add to that, so like I have a friend who also I invited for a talk. And
yeah,
he said that he started learning microservices, and when
Yeah.
he did an interview, it's like the hiring manager doesn't know a lot about microservice, so
Yes.
he looks like an expert already and decided.
yeah, exactly. So if you're on the cutting edge of all of that stuff and you actually read all the documentation that the core developers put together, then you're probably, the second most experienced level of person for that. Because the most experienced level is the actual like people at AWS who are building it and who know their product really well and know how all the underlying stuff of the product works and have to know all the operating system level stuff because they actually do have servers they have to manage to give us this product. But if you read all their documentation and you have a good chance to actually jump in there and dive into it, then you're going to be way better off with that newer stuff. Yeah, the main thing I'd suggest is to start looking at the job descriptions for the things that you might be interested in, maybe like a year before you actually start applying for stuff, and start spending some time learning all the skills that are in those job descriptions.
By the way, go ahead and promote yourself because we're also in recording, so-
Also, what I do now, I'm curious.
So I make courses. So if you want to know what I do, you can just check out my blog. It's fernandomc.com. I make courses for companies that have like basically like online courses. So if you want to go and learn about serverless development, if you want to go and learn about passing an AWS certification, that kind of stuff, I have courses that walk through in a lot more detail. Every step you'll need to know. Not quite as much like this, where it was just like trying to get through everything, but really just step by step and like tools that are going to help you learn it. For example, instead of making you create an AWS account in some of my courses, those are just provided for you, so you get some signing credentials and an explanation of how to go through all the things that you need to learn. Yeah.
So is this your own company or you're working with other company?
Yeah, good question. So right now I work full-time in a company called Linux Academy. And I also have 2 courses published previously for a company called Portofolio.com.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. So still, we want to have more connection, but I'm sorry,
Yeah.
I'm commuting by train.
Oh, no worries.
So that's why
Thank you.
here's I put $1 million. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But
Yeah.
you have
Don't
a
take
bag
anything
for
out of
$1
it.
million. Bingo.
Oh, thank you.
CDU.
Thank you. These are great.
CDU mug.
You start in
something
your
else.
place.
All right. I'll put all
Okay.
these right next
Then
to my desk.
also,
Thank you.
please advertise our CDU.
Yeah, I'll wear this all the way back home.
Yeah, and then also we are looking for a hackathon here.
Okay.
We may have that. We
Like
have
a
a
workshop.
foundation. Then also
Cool.
you can come. You can bring the more people here,
Oh, thank
and you
you.
can also advertise
Thank you.
your program too.
Sure, yeah. I'd be happy to.
Yes. Hey, picture.
Oh, yeah.
Put into the.
No, wait, that's
Hey,
now.
we put into this one the website. And my brother in Korea, he found it and said, "What's going on there?"
Cool.
Hey, take it.
Take this. I gotta
Yes.
put the logo on.
Okay. Done.
Yes.
Thank you.
Then I can go home now. That
Okay.
was my job.
You have the proof.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Fernando.
Thank you so much for coming. So do you all have Clark's information?
Yeah, definitely.
Because I'll make sure I leave all the links with him, but I don't want to make you late for class. So
Yeah.
just email him or he'll send it out and I'll give you the links and my information so you can ask any follow-up questions too. If you don't have class, I'll still be here, but if you have to run off, I'll give him my info so you can contact me if you
I
have a few
perform to
questions.
listen today.
Thank you for coming.
Stay here like before like
Okay.
just
Yeah, cool.
Could I ask a
Ask
question?
away, yeah, questions.
Yeah. So what is the biggest benefit to use serverless framework besides you can deploy to different providers?
Yeah, so
What other benefits it can?
yeah, so when you're doing just a bunch of custom stuff, you're gonna have to write more code to like deploy a DynamoDB table or a SQSQ. Thank you so much for coming. And it just ends up taking more time and more code, and it's a little bit harder to manage just by yourself because there aren't any standards around. Oh well, like we just made a DynamoDB table. Like, are we using CloudFormation to describe the DynamoDB table and saving that in a source repository? Are we using Terraform to do that? It's kind of like one potential option to manage some of your infrastructure. You don't have to use it. I just use it because it's easy enough to get people started really quickly because there's so many demos already using the serverless framework, and all I have to tell people is like, okay, git clone this project, make sure you have the serverless framework installed, and then SLS deploy. And if you have your AWS stuff configured, it's up there.
Do we really have to write that server VM file to configure where to deploy, or serverless will create that file?
So do you have to write?
I saw there's a file you have to put all of the resource, your service.
Oh, so like the SLS, the YAML file?
Yes. Do we have to write it by yourself, or serverless framework will create it?
like generated?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So for a lot of like demos, you'll have this already. If you want to write your own stuff, you can use some boilerplates that will help you get started. But it's not too bad to write.
No, it's not bad to write, but it's really hard to maintain. If I have a really large project, they will go, forever. I have that experience, long time ago to develop a Java backend with Spring framework, and they have this kind of thing. It really goes long.
Yeah,
in India, nobody can understand it even.
Yeah, so I think part of it is that this will help at least manage the infrastructure, but another part of it is that you're right. That's why some teams are kind of moving microservice-y related things.
That should be helpful.
But
can keep this smaller.
Yeah, it really depends on the project and the team and kind of what you're making. If it's this small, right? It's like a few files.
Yeah, that's
and like it's easy enough. But when you're building a full-fledged like web application, you're right. It gets cumbersome to manage all the different files, all the different services. Like, do you have different teams that each have a bunch of these kinds of files and things? Do you have different stuff you have to do with that? Like, you're right, and it does. So I think there's a lot of different approaches to it. Some are to kind of go microservice-y and break these up into like self-contained services that are APIs that you can plug into your front end, and you just have the front end team, maybe a build process that actually takes the output of a deployment and throws it into the front end code and kind of manages all that. But you also have people who are maybe just using like, I don't know, like a Flask, something to create the whole API, and then they just do a really good job like structuring either Flask or Django or some other sort of framework that's running some node framework or something to control the whole API. So there's a few different options for sure. Okay. I'd say I'll include these in the resources, but there's a lot of community groups to talk about this and ask questions too. And a lot of them are going to be better at me than certain things like testing.
This kind of thing still kind of new. People,
for
me, it's like people still, try to see what is the
They are, they're trying to figure it out. So that's definitely true. And that's always the case with the new stuff.
I'm so excited about this.
Yeah, and then it's kind of nice though, because if nobody's figured it out, that means you get to.
Yeah. It's not just because that, because I told you I made a small project for a company, and I'm only the person working on that project. I also have to maintain, that service. It's so painful. Sometimes it's just an update. I say, oh, give me 5 minutes, I will done with that. And take me an hour still working on it.
Yeah.
It's so painful.
Yeah, that's another thing I like about this. It's just quick updates, quick deployments, and
I just focus on my code. It's not service, not security issue. I don't really know that.
Yeah. Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions? If you need to go to class, go for it. But I have a few more minutes.
I'm sorry.
Also, it's nice that you showed us that you just created simple projects. Because like, it would motivate like some of us to like create those simple projects. Because some of us have this like probably. Oh, what project you're in? The very first project.
Yeah.
Right. So
Keep it simple. Yeah. That's definitely my advice.
Oh,
Because I'm halfway through like 3 big projects that I'm never going back to because I lost motivation. There's like GitHub repos that are just not finished that are never going to be finished by me. So yeah.
I have other
You guys
question
know
for the Lambda function. Actually, I saw they charge you from 2 ways. One is how many times you call. Other is the duration of your running the function.
Yeah, so I think the formula is the duration and the memory size. So you can think of it kind of like a square, right? So if it runs a long time and it has a lot of memory, it's going to be more expensive. If it has less memory and it runs less, it's going to be less expensive.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. That
But
motivate people
there's
to
like a
write
million
code.
free indications of certain memory limits.
But if you want to use it for a company for a real project, you have to tell them this before they really pick this approach. So what is the
If you're
future?
planning on having like a lot of invocations, maybe, but you can have like at least 100 simultaneous ones. So unless you're getting like 100, unless you're getting like more than 100 requests a second, then you should get like you should be able to make money before you need to worry about it, right? Like so that's what I like about it. It's like whenever I build something small, I'm like, oh cool. If I have like $100, this should get me like through 3 years at least. Like by the time I get my first few clients, then I can worry about that, I guess. And that's one of the big benefits that they push is like you don't have to worry.
Yeah, they're pretty smart. Actually.
Yeah, so they're just like, yeah, just go for it. Use this. You know, in the long run, you might need to refactor, but if your project doesn't succeed anyway, like who cares?
They will stop using
that's a
it
good
anyway.
problem to have in the long run. If you get to hit the top of the free tier, then you're probably making bank off your users, or you have a valuable.
And at that
application,
moment,
so.
it's really hard to switch to other providers. So
Yeah,
you
but you don't. But yeah, that's their strategy,
That's
right?
pretty
It's to lock you in, but. Like the serverless framework kind of helps you avoid that if you do want to switch over and you write the code in the right way. But overall, I think it's kind of the benefits outweigh some of the risks sometimes because you can just see if it works, and if you need to, you can always change things over. But,
Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you. Thanks for coming.